So let us continue. We're still in chapter 6 of Eagleton's Ideology, and chapter 6 from Schopenhauer to Searle. And the thinker that we're now looking at, we've looked at Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. Now we're going to turn to Freud. And Freud, according to Eagleton, is the most illustrious inheritor of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche's irrationalist tradition. So the irrationalism that he talked about with Schopenhauer, and more so with Nietzsche, we now find is picked up by Freud. Now, this irrationalist tradition, what does it say? Well, according to Eagleton, it's something like that the mind is characterized by a chronic distortion. And the mind itself is kind of like an outgrowth of something more fundamental. And of course, we saw this with our previous thinkers, Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, namely, especially in Schopenhauer. Like in Schopenhauer, like the mind, the little will and all that is this outgrowth or this sort of distillation of the greater will with the capital W. Nietzsche, the mind and the subject and everything is constituted in power. So the idea here is that you don't have this mind that something has to come to it and then twists it. Rather, it's in the very construction of what we're calling the mind, the self, and all that, that this twisting occurs. So you don't have a pure subject that is then corrupted. No, this is all part of the formation of the subject. So in Freud, we don't have will or power or whatever. We have this notion of the unconscious. And so the mind is something like again, an outgrowth. And or the ego is this, and the superego. These are all kind of byproducts of the unconscious. So you can sort of think of them in sometimes they're taught like they're three different things, the id or the unconscious id, then the ego, and then the superego and all these, that these are three separate things. Not really. They're all kind of outgrowths of this fundamental blind sort of unconscious grasping kind of thing. And so, yeah, and then and what we tend to think of as the rational side, it's this outgrowth of these other things. And we've seen, again, for Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, they have a similar sort of notion. And this unconscious, turns towards the world. It has kind of these impulses, impulse to know. But again, what's kind of the dark side of all this stuff is that this impulse to know and to create anything is all tainted or inseparable from a desire, right? So desire is really what's at the root of all this. And the impulse to know is inseparable from desire, and this desire is like to possess, to take control of, and to dominate. And so this all the structuring and all the acquisition of knowledge is taking place within this kind of a framework. Indeed, the knowing, even the separation that really underlies knowledge, like subject object, the knowing subject and the known or knowable object. This originates from sort of an infantile life, and Freud tries to tell a story of how we build up these concepts, not literally like in a sort of a grand metaphysical system where the mind actually constructs reality in that sense, but the mind creates all its constructs. It creates, that is, all of the constructs that it uses to build and formulate knowledge. How does it do that? Well, it's a long, complicated process, very controversial. But the infant, in this infantile life, it has exchanges with its environment, expels and interjects. And this reciprocal notion, this pattern, constitutes the contrast of self and the world. It builds this up. And this is the foundation of an ego. And all of the remaining thought and knowledge and all that stuff takes place under this structure that occurs, is developed in early childhood. So consciousness, thought, perception, again, not surprising, all tainted with desire. And this is just, as Freud says, that's just the psychopathology of everyday, of daily life. That's it. We're kind of sort of all a little bit sick, according to Freud. Now, what about ideology? Freud, as Eagleton, again, this is Eagleton's reading of Freud. Freud doesn't talk that much about Eagleton, or sorry, Freud doesn't talk that much about ideology, says Eagleton. He's like Althusser, who thought of ideology as lived relations. So Freud is kind of along those lines. Freud also thinks that, like Althusser, that subjects are born in the context of all these lived relations and is a product of all this distorting factors. Right? Remember, it's not something that comes to be and then is distorted. It's born within all these distorted products. Also, that the self, in order to emerge, has to this process, which is not easy to follow, but there's a sort of an intrinsic opacity to the self. It's got to suppress this unconscious in order to become somewhat conscious, and there's a self opacity in the formation of a subject. So it seems that even in psychoanalysis, any attempt to get to the fundamentals, you would be blocked. There would be something opaque at the bottom of your subjectivity. And all this is just chock full of desires, fantasies, and fictions. And there really wouldn't be a way to get to the bottom of it all. Now, this seems rather dystopic, to say the least, that, we're fundamentally opaque in a deep sense, even to ourselves. That's not completely original with Freud. That too has a history, not with guys like Descartes or whatnot, but even Kant thought the human heart was fundamentally infinite. There's lots of things you can't really know about it. Plato too talked like that, that there was some sort of irrational elements deep in the soul that we couldn't really know. So this idea of an opacity of the subject has a long history, but it plays a huge role in Freud's thought, and that it taints all of us, where we can't really break entirely free of it. Now, again, that sounds very dystopic, but Eagleton then points out in a later work of Freud on religion, Freud's work is called The Future of an Illusion. Now, religion, he thinks, is a kind of illusion, but he has a sort of a little bit of a different critique of ideology, and it brings out another side of Freud's thinking. So again, Freud is not just monolithic in one, he puts down one view and holds it completely watertight for his entire career. No, he changes his mind, and he's a complicated thinker. He says religion is kind of a trade-off, right? What is that? Well, the world is kind of this bleak, uncaring place. And what's religion? Well, religion is something that gives comfort, right? It gives meaning, gives lots of meaning. There's got to be more than this. Yes, says religion. Yes, there is more than this. This is an arena or something. So there is a comfort factor in religion. Is that all there is? Some people say yes, some people say no. According to Freud, that was the big thing about religion, is its comfort factor. But it's not pure comfort, because religion, is a trade-off. It says you got to do certain things in order to get the comfort of, let's say, getting the goods from religion. You're going to pay a certain price. You got to behave in certain ways. You got to curtail certain desires. You got to put the brakes on some things that you might otherwise like to do. You don't get to do them, but the trade is you maybe get to go to heaven or something like that. So there's kind of a deal involved, and some of the demands can be quite stringent and quite difficult. But nonetheless, the idea is that you get some security or peace of mind. But again, this is kind of illusion for Freud, and what's always going to have is that this is going to, even if you internalize rules, it's always going to lead to some kind of neuroses, right? So even if you internalize religion, it's going to cause conflicts and all kinds of things within you. Again, all part of the natural daily sort of psychopathology of life, and so you're going to get neuroses out of this. But nonetheless, religion is a kind of illusion, and as Eagleton points out, there is a strand sort of in Freud of sort of this kind of quasi-enlightenment view of reason, that, well, reason is very quiet compared to the passions, as we all know. Usually people who are much more passionate than reason will tend to be louder and whatnot. Okay, fine, if that's kind of the Freudian line on things. But the other side of Freud is this notion that, well, reason might be quieter, okay, But in the end, reason will persist. It will have its day in court. Even if that day is a long way in the future, it will not be indefinitely long into the future. Someday it will have its say, and it might help us to kind of escape. So that's kind of an old Enlightenment view, that it's through reason we'll escape. Freud also discusses a number of other things that are illusions, trade-offs, like culture, maybe even psychoanalysis itself. But all of these things, religion, psychoanalysis, these are all hegemonic processes. And so with that idea of hegemony, you should be thinking Gramsci, and not a surprise that Eagleton is off on a discussion of how Freud's thought relates to that of Gramsci. Nonetheless, with this internalization, you still always have these neuroses. And that's always kind of the roots of rebellion. So systems can last for a while, they're internalized, but they still create tensions within the subject. Now, there's a lot more going on in Eagleton's discussion. That gives you sort of the basics of it. But for Freud, says Eagleton, this real and imaginary and fantasy, these things are all bound up together. And regarding ideology, for Freud, again, he doesn't discuss it that much. It's the fundamental roots are the mechanisms that Freud thinks he's discovered or uncovered in the production of cells, right? The mechanisms of psychical life. And that's what Eagleton thinks is sort of this real profound contribution that Freud has to the study of ideology, is that how it's all part and parcel of the nature of how we develop as cells. So again, it's very similar to some of the other kinds of thinkers that that Eagleton is like, is that the production of subjects is not a subject then gets twisted, but it's produced within a certain kind of matrix or a certain kind of framework. All right, so once again, I've run out of board space. I'll come back and finish this chapter in the next video by looking at George Seurat. See you then.